So what is the Unix shell? It's the subject material of this course, so I guess it's reasonable that we have a good understanding of what it actually is. Well, let's take that question back one step and ask, what is a shell? Do you know the answer to that? What is a shell? When it comes to an operating system, what is the shell? You might like to pause the movie here and have a bit of a think about your answer to this particular question. I'm asking not what is the Unix shell in particular, but what is a shell? Just pause for a moment and see if you can come up with an answer. How did you go? Well, of course, there are many ways of answering that question. Here's one that works quite well for me. A shell is simply a program that is used to start other programs. You can think of it as, if you like, your user interface to the operating system. And if an operating system presents to you a user interface, what is the operating system hoping you will do next? Well, you'll probably use that user interface to start other programs. Just by way of comparison, I can show you the shells from various other operating systems that you may or may not be familiar with. They all have them. The shell for DOS, if you've ever been using DOS, is the old favorite command.com. That's the program responsible for creating the C prompt on your black and white screen there. If you've used Windows 3.1 or Windows NT, any version of that, less than 4, you will probably be familiar with the program called Program Manager. Now, as you can see, both Program Manager and command.com are simply programs that are used to start other programs. They both go about it completely different ways. With command.com, you have to type in the name of the program that you want and then press enter. With Program Manager, you're presented with a series of icons which you then double click on to start the program that you want. And later versions of Windows, such as Windows 95, 98, 2000 and so on, use a program known as Windows Explorer. That's the program responsible for putting the icons on your desktop and also for putting the Start button in the lower left hand corner of your screen. Anyway, let's talk a bit more about the Unix shell in particular. The Unix shell is a little bit like DOS's command.com in that it is a command line shell. It's a text shell. It requires that if you want to start a particular program, that you type the name of that program onto what we call a command line and then press enter. And of course, the way that you do it, the words that you type and the order that you type them in, is of paramount importance. If you get it wrong, the program will not start, or it will start incorrectly. And the set of rules that specify how you must type in commands is called the syntax of the command line shell. Also, command launchers, the Unix shell, also provide certain built-in features for the user. And I've shown two examples there. The first one is CD. CD is actually not a Unix program. CD is a feature of the shell. There is nowhere on a Unix system that you'll find an executable program called CD. The notion of changing directories and keeping track of the current directory that you're in is something that the shell provides you. The second example there I've shown you is the ability to take the output of one program and store it in a file. This is called redirection, and it is a feature offered to you by the shell. And of course there are many more such features, and it is precisely those features that we are going to be looking at for virtually all of this course. Now you can tie those two above points together and say that if the shell offers the facility to read the commands from a text file, in other words, instead of just typing the commands that you want whenever you see a prompt and pressing enter, you can actually put all the commands that you want into a file and ask the shell to execute all the commands in that file in sequence. If the shell offers the facility to do that, then the syntax that we talked about in the first bullet point and the features in the second bullet point may all be collectively thought of as a programming language. And those files, where you've written down the names of the commands that you want to run, those can be thought of as scripts or programs. Thus, the shell is actually two things. It is a user interface between you and the operating system for the purpose of starting programs, and it is also a programming language. Incidentally, the DOS shell, which is command.com, is also a programming language in the same way that the Unix shell is a programming language, because the DOS interpret batch files. Batch files are the DOS equivalent of shell scripts. The Unix shell's syntax and built-in commands are far superior to those of command.com. Okay, so I hope from this particular module you have a slightly better understanding of what it is that the Unix shell is for. It's important to note in the Unix world that there are actually a variety of Unix shells to choose from, and they're not all the same. So, if we're going to be learning about programming using the Unix shell, we'd better stipulate exactly which shell we're talking about. Anyway, the and most widely supported of all shells is called the Bourne shell, named after the fellow that created it. It was one of the original shells of Unix. The file that contains the Bourne shell, the program, can be found in the file called sh, which is usually located in the /bin directory. While the Bourne shell is not particularly popular as far as interactive login shells go, meaning that when people log in they don't usually find themselves in the Bourne shell, it is overwhelmingly popular as far as shell scripts are concerned. Over 95% of the shell scripts in the world are Bourne shell scripts. And for that reason, we're going to focus just on those scripts and those scripts only. For example, I will not be describing the Unix C shell. I'll discuss what that is in just a moment, but that will be the last time I mention it in this course. Now, the Bourne shell, historically speaking, was one of the first shells in Unix, and as far as interactivity is concerned, in other words, as far as logging in and actually using the shell on a day-to-day basis to run your commands, it's fairly rudimentary. It doesn't offer very many user-friendly features, and so several other shells were developed that were based on the Bourne shell, and these do offer more user-friendly features, such as the Korn shell that was created by a fellow called David Korn. Its file name is KSH, and theoretically you can only get a copy of that if you have a license from, well, I'm not sure from whom, but you have to get a license. Anyway, there is the Born Again shell, or bash, little Unix wit there for you, which is open source and completely free. You can download the source code, compile it yourself, or you can download pre-compiled executables if you like. Bash is particularly popular amongst Linux users on PCs. And then there's ZSH or ZSH and many others. These shells are supposed to be Bourne compatible. What does it mean to say that a shell is Bourne compatible? Written a script to be interpreted using the Bourne shell, then it will theoretically be able to be run by these shells as well. In other words, you could take your script and run it using the Korn shell as the interpreter, or the Born Again shell. However, not all shells are Bourne compatible. In fact, there's a whole family of shells that are not. Specifically, the C shell. There's another little bit of Unix wit there for you. You may or may not have heard of a programming language, a very powerful programming language called C. There was a movement at one stage during early C programmers who worked in Unix that they wanted to have a shell that would offer a programming language that was perhaps more powerful, or at least more similar to their favorite C language. So they created for themselves another shell called the C shell. The programming language of the C shell is slightly different to that of the Bourne shell, and it even offers some features not found in Bourne shell scripting. However, it is more complex to use and is reportedly a little bit buggy, so it is not used very often. We will not be covering it during this course. The C shell in turn spawned its own family of compatible shells, most notably TCSH, but we won't be covering any of those. We're going to focus on the universal Bourne shell. Needless to say that a script created for the Bourne shell will not be able to be run using the C shell, and vice versa. They are incompatible. Very ultra simple scripts, of course, will run using either, but as soon as you start to use some of the more powerful language features, you are restricting yourself to one of those two shells.